Syria, US, British and French forces launch airstrikes in response to chemical weapons attack. US, British and French forces have pounded chemical weapons sites in Syria with airstrikes in response to an alleged poison gas attack that killed dozens in the rebel-held town of Douma last week. In a televised address to the nation, U.S. President Donald Trump said the three nations had marshaled their righteous power against barbarism and brutality. The strikes were the biggest intervention by Western powers against President Bashar al-Assad in the country's 7-year-old civil war, which has pitted the U.S. and its allies against Russia. The Pentagon said the strikes targeted a research center in Damascus, along with a chemical weapons storage facility and command post west of Homs. Russia's ambassador to the U.S. Anatoly Antonov said in a statement that Russia had warned that such actions will not be left without consequences. U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis said the strikes were a one-time shot to send a clear message to Mr. Assad and his murderous lieutenants. Clearly the Assad regime did not get the message last year, Mr. Mattis said. We did everything we could in our intelligence assessment and our planning to minimize to the maximum degree any chance of civilian casualties. He said the U.S. did not coordinate with Russia on the strike, nor did it pre-notify the Russians. We specifically identified these targets to mitigate the risk of Russian forces being involved, Mr. Mattis said. Mr. Trump said the strikes were in response to the evil and the despicable chemical attack on April 7, which left mothers and fathers, infants and children, thrashing in pain and gasping for air. These are not the actions of a man, they are crimes of a monster, Mr. Trump said, referring to Mr. Assad. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres urged all nations to show restraint in these dangerous circumstances. I have repeatedly expressed my deep disappointment that the Security Council failed to agree on a dedicated mechanism for effective accountability for the use of chemical weapons in Syria, Mr. Guterres said. I urge the Security Council to assume its responsibilities and fill this gap. British Prime Minister Theresa May said the strikes were not about intervening in a civil war, nor were they about a regime change. We cannot allow the use of chemical weapons to become normalized within Syria, on the streets of the UK, or anywhere else in our world, Ms. May said, referencing the recent nerve gas attack on a Russian double agent in England. It is a limited and targeted strike that does not further escalate tensions in the region, and that does everything possible to prevent civilian casualties, she said. French President Emmanuel Macron said a red line has been crossed. Cannot tolerate the trivialization of the use of chemical weapons, which is an immediate danger for the Syrian people and for our collective security, Mr. Macron said. Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull said Australia supported the strikes, which demonstrated a calibrated, proportionate and targeted response. The use of chemical weapons by anyone, anywhere, under any circumstances, is illegal and utterly reprehensible, Mr. Turnbull said. The Assad regime must not be allowed to commit such crimes with impunity. The Pentagon said the U.S. and its allies fired more than 100 missiles from ships and aircraft. It could not confirm how many missiles hit their targets. A pro-Assad official said about 30 missiles were fired at Syria and that about a third were shot down. Several explosions were heard in Damascus. Black plumes of smoke were seen rising from in the east, and the sky turned orange. After the attack, vehicles with loudspeakers roamed the capital's streets blaring nationalist songs. In a tweet, Syrian opposition leader Nasser al-Hariri called for an end to what he described as all attacks against civilians by the Syrian state and its allies, whether using chemical or conventional weapons. Maybe the regime will not use chemical weapons again, but it will not hesitate to use weapons the international community has allowed it, such as barrel bombs and cluster bombs, Mr. Hariri said. Mr. Trump said the U.S. was not seeking an indefinite presence in Syria. He said the U.S. would be a partner and a friend to the Middle East, but the fate of the region lay in the hands of its own people. As other nations step up their contributions, we look forward to the day when we can bring our warriors home, he said. No amount of American blood or treasure can produce lasting peace and security in the Middle East. We will try to make it better, but it is its Russia's defense ministry said the majority of missiles fired during the attack were intercepted by Syrian air defense systems using Soviet-produced hardware, including the Buk missile system.